Welcome to chapter 2 in our course, right? So we are going to be looking at Introduction to Research Literature and understanding what it is we are trying to look for as we are trying to better understand the topics we want to do research on. First of all, let me tell you, this week is not nearly as burdensome as last week. Last week's overview was huge, so I recognize that. Try and put that in as much of a box as you can, understand the little parts of it, and know that we're going to go deeper into every area as we move forward. Let's start this week with a quick review of some of the things we talked about last week. So in chapter 1, we talked about qualitative and quantitative research, right? So you remember that quantitative research was data based on numbers and statistics. So we were looking at how do we take data and view it as a number and then do statistical analysis to identify our changes, our improvements, our whatever it is that we are trying to identify, right? Qualitative data, we talked about in that research, it's about words, it's about deeper understanding, it's about themes. So we are looking at different ways of gathering that data. That doesn't mean there's never numbers involved, but it's less statistical and it's more interpretation in understanding the themes. Okay? We talked about variables last week. When we talked about variables, we talked about categorical variables, right? Names or labels, gender, ethnicity, right? Just trying to put things into boxes to help us understand them. We talked about continuous variables, right? Things that are on a continuum. So we're talking about weight, blood pressure, right? BMI, those sorts of things would all be continuous variables as we try to identify or put them in a box, if you will. You should know, moving forward, the difference between independent and a dependent variable. So in our quantitative research design, if we're doing experimental research, we will have our variables. We'll often say the dependent variable and the independent variable. The independent variable is the variable which we manipulate. The dependent variable is the outcome variable. So let's say we are doing a study on the impact of vitamin D in heart disease. So in that situation, what would be our independent variable? What are we manipulating? The vitamin D, right? So our dependent variable, the outcome is the heart disease, right? So our independent variable, we would be looking in that research design in terms of how much vitamin D we give to a particular group, when we give it, how we give it, right? All those things could be impactful as we then look at the outcome variable of the heart disease later on. We have to keep in mind our extraneous variables, right? Other things that can impact the outcome, and we have to take those into consideration. So in that idea of a research study, right, an experimental research study that involves vitamin D and heart disease, what are the other extraneous variables that could impact heart disease? You should be thinking about things like weight, stress level, diet, smoking, right? All of those things, lifestyle, all of those things can fall into or would be extraneous variables that would impact the outcome. So how do we take those into consideration when we're doing our research? All right, so we'll talk about that more later on when we get deeper into the experimental designs. But you should keep those in mind. Remember, you've got a quiz to complete this week on chapter 1. So I would want to know all the things listed on this slide. I would also want to make sure that you remember your process for the scientific method. What is the purpose of the scientific method? What is the process for the scientific method? All right, let's go ahead and move on, and we'll talk about this week's material. Promise you it's not as overwhelming as last week. So we're looking at research, all right? We're looking at, again, when we talk about research, it's a process. And the first step in research is recognizing or understanding what the body of knowledge is on a particular topic. And the way we do that is through what we call a lit review, understanding and reading what has already been learned. How do we do that? Well, we're looking for articles. Keeping in mind, anybody can write something and get it on the web, right? Publishing is easier today than it ever has been. So you want to make sure that the information that you are gathering is valid information, right? That think about, is there bias? Is there motivation behind something? And we certainly know over the past number of years that based on your political beliefs, you can find research, right? You can find an article that is going to verify anything you want to believe. So we want to look at the potential bias when we're looking at the research, right? So we want scholarly research with citations that are ideally peer-reviewed, meaning others with expertise in that area have looked at your research model and determined that it was valid, okay? So be very leery of websites or that sort of information that doesn't give you citations, and consider the bias. So magazines and newspapers. Can you use magazines and newspapers as part of your literature review overview, right? That initial step in the research. Yes and no. Okay, so be aware that magazines and newspapers, they're written by journalists, not subject matter experts. Okay, they're written in a language that is simple and easy to understand, so typically the 4th grade level. They provide general information and entertainment, but they often contain bias, right? So consider where you're getting it from. The New York Times, the Washington Post, they each have their own certain level of bias, okay? Not significant in those two cases, but they do lean right or they do lean a little bit left in terms of political affiliations. So just be aware of that in terms of what you're doing. Does that mean you can never use magazines and newspapers in your research? No. I would contend that there are places in your research where magazines and newspaper articles may help you. So, in your research, in your writing of research, your lit review, your articles, you never ever want to assume that people know something. You need to prove it. Everything you say needs a citation. You don't want to start with, everyone knows that obesity in America has reached epidemic proportions. That might be true, but you need to prove it. You need to cite where you got that information, and you never write the words everybody knows in scholarly research, okay? So this is where newspapers or magazines may be valid sources in your introductory paragraphs as you are establishing the problem that you want to use as the base of your research. You want to justify your research. You want to show that there is a significant problem that you need to try and solve. And that's where a newspaper or magazine may come in to help you with that big picture. This is a big problem. And then you're going to use more scholarly research to narrow that down as you're writing your article. Okay, so that's where you might find newspapers and magazines. Keep in mind the bias of media. I pulled this up a couple of years ago. It's still valid. They put a new one out every year or so. This looks at the news media and where they fall in terms of bias and where they fall in terms of facts. So when you look at something like this, you're looking at down at this lower level, right? These sorts of websites, news magazines, whatever we want to call them, right, have a more of an entertainment value and less factual data. As we move to the top, we're getting more in terms of the factual data. As we move to the center here, we're getting less bias, right? So here, less truth, more bias. Less truth, more bias. Here, the most truth and the least bias, right? So when I'm looking for my news personally, I want to stick to something that is closer to this center, to AP, right? So Associated Press tends to be, for the most part, facts, period, no interpretation. So that's where you get your least amount of bias. So just consider that in your news sources. Trade publications, right? These are going to be great for some of your research. So the articles are generally written for members of a profession, right? They may be factual, anecdotal, or opinion. They're generally published for the members of a particular area. They may or may not have scientific background. They may or may not include a bibliography. Again, when you see that bibliography, when you see that citation of where the data came from, you're getting closer to scholarly research. So just be careful about how you use trade publications. Again, like your newspapers, they may help you to define a problem or tell you the state of the industry when you're putting that in your introduction to your problem. They're probably not going to give you a lot of detailed research that you're looking for the foundation, for that meat of your scholarly review, right? They're going to use jargon that's known to the targeted profession. Examples: today's dietitian, food service director, food management, nation's restaurant news. So good trade publications, great to start with, not always going to offer you the most scholarly information, but viable sources of some information. I want you to be focused on academic journals, on scholarly writing. So research or articles written by researchers with expertise in an area, right? They usually undergo peer review process, which means that folks with knowledge, right, experts in that field, have looked at the article, and they're not necessarily trying to say the outcomes are perfect. They're saying the outcomes are valid. And what they mean by that is that they've looked at the process through which the research was done. What was the method of the study, and did the method of the study lean towards giving valid outcome data, right? So that's what peer review is looking for, is that someone followed protocols to get to the answer of the problem they were trying to solve, right? Again, targeted to an audience of researchers, professors, and students in a specific field. We assume the reader has basic knowledge of the topic. They will include a reference list. Where did we get the data we started from? So medical and scientific journals comply with a basic structure. They will always have an abstract, an introduction, a method section, a results section, a discussion, and a conclusion. Remember that abstract you write after everything else. It's like that executive summary. Introduction establishes the problem and tells us what we know about the information, the body of knowledge on that topic as we're about to move forward, and then why my research, why this article, this research becomes important, how I do or am going to do or did, right, the research. What are the results? Results are data, period. Here's the results. The discussion, here's what the results mean. And the conclusion, here's how we utilize this and move forward. And often I will tell you that that leads to, and here's what we need to do in our next study. So examples of that. Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, Journal of American Medical Association, all great places to find scholarly articles. Different types of research articles. Now remember, last week we mentioned that there are 3 different types of basic research, right? So we've got primary research, which was original research studies, right? Original studies. We had secondary research, which was a review of existing studies, and we had tertiary research, right, which was a review of multiple studies, but not looking at the primary research necessarily. So when we look at articles, articles can be written with different lenses, right? We can have the original research, which includes qualitative or quantitative research studies. I did primary research. I turned that primary research into an original research article. That's what you're looking for primarily in your literature reviews. Focus on original primary research. You can also have research editorials, so written by subject matter experts who are discussing a study in a broader context. They'll provide evidence, they'll have resources, references, right? And then you'll have review articles. And narrative reviews are the most common. So they include a summary and evaluation of existing research. They're pulling multiple research pieces together to show you how they work together. These are great articles to help you to understand the body of knowledge. But I will always encourage you as a researcher, you need to go back and find the original primary research when you're quoting it in your lit review, okay? So the narrative review is great. Go back and find the original as well. And yes, you can work yourself down a rabbit hole. That's what we do. Systematic reviews summarizes the findings of similar but separate original research studies. Again, great way to start to understand the existing body of knowledge. But go back and find the originals. And then scoping reviews determine the scope of literature on a particular topic. In your book, here's just a list of some nutrition-related journals, right? The American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, Journal of Epidemiology, Preventive Medicine, Annual Review of Nutrition, and so on. So again, good places to find original articles. There's also what we call gray literature. I'm not saying never use this, just recognize it's a little bit different. And you have lots of access to this because this is literature, documents that are published outside of traditional journals. So dissertations and theses all fall into that category. They can be good original research. They have a good lit review associated with them. They have been reviewed by peers, right, by a team. You can also look at conference proceedings, textbooks, professional reference books, technical reports. These are all good sources of data. They're considered gray literature. Use them. Don't use them exclusively in your lit review. All right, finding data today is really easy, right? We have search engines that are going to help us find everything we need. PubMed, Web of Science, great search engines. They also have a fee for researchers. But guess what? You're a student. As a student, working through the Sac State Library website, their search engines will utilize these other search engines. So your Sac State Library search engine is ideal for the research that you want to do. And I'm going to encourage you to use that for a little activity that we're going to do this week as part of your discussion board, okay? Google Scholar is another thing that you can easily use for free in terms of looking for good scholarly research. There is a secondary video for you to glance at. It's only a few minutes after this video. That video takes a look at the websites as we work our way through a little bit of Google Scholar, as well as what we're going to talk about in just a moment. Keep in mind, traditionally, not always, things have changed a little bit, but traditionally, websites that end in .gov or .edu tend to have good quality research. I'm going to be brutally honest. There is a fear at this point among researchers that the .gov research is no longer as trustworthy as it might have been in the past. So just be aware of potential bias, which we didn't used to have in government, and we are seeing more of at this point. .edu is probably good research. APA 7 style. APA is the foundation or the style in which we in the nutrition profession and medical professions write our articles, our papers. So it's very important. It is very codified in the way that we do that in terms of what that looks like. So when you want to verify, when you want to understand APA, you can Google the Purdue OWL, or these links will take you directly to the Purdue OWL and give you examples of what a sample paper outline, what it should look like, right? What your reference page should look like, how you should do in-text citations for your paper. It is very specific. It is very codified, and I will hold you to these standards in your lit review as well as your final paper in this class. So you're going to become very familiar with the intricacies of APA style. In the second video on this page today, you will find I go to the OWL Purdue website and show you a little bit of this. We'll talk about it more in class in upcoming weeks. I would also encourage you, as you are starting to write your own papers, when you're doing your lit review, which we will talk about in the next couple of weeks, in your mind, you should start to be thinking about topics that you want to do your research on. You need to cite everything in your paper. So there are lots of ways to keep organized. For a lot of folks today, citation management software is a great way to do that. EndNote, you can find. Mendeley, you can find. Some of them have a cost, so you may not want to do that. You may find EndNote for free, right? It just depends. You might be very old school. Again, I started research years ago, so yes, I use these sometimes, but I'm also just as likely to open up an Excel spreadsheet and create my own software management. The great thing about good software management is that it will take your data and it will put it into your citation APA. You can say APA and it will automatically take your data and put it into that format, which will help you later on. Not only that, but this software will help you to take notes, which again is where I go back to an Excel file on what that article tells us. What was the research that was done? How was it done? And then what were the outcomes? What did we learn from that research? So that those can be applied in the writing of your lit review later on. Okay, so however you want to handle that, just something to think about. When we look at our articles, when you write your lit review, we always start with an introduction, right? The introduction in a research article, any publication, begins with a review of the relevant research literature. That's what your lit review is going to be. This presents a comprehensive, accurate understanding of the current state of knowledge on the topic and includes the gaps. What do we not know about the topic? Which typically is then what leads to the justification of your study, right? So that's what the lit review is intended to do. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. This is why I've created this study. Does that make sense? All right. The introduction should also include the problem statement. Why is this a problem? Why should more research be done on this area? Or research objective, depending on how we're writing the particular article. Possible hypothesis. If you're doing a study, an experimental study or quasi-experimental study design, then you might have a hypothesis involved. You don't have to have a hypothesis in experimental study, and you would never have a hypothesis in qualitative research. So just be aware that may or may not be part of the introduction. The problem statement. We're going to look at this more a little bit in future classes, but we're trying to contextualize the problem. What do we already know? Describe the exact issue that your research is going to address, and what do you still need to know, right? That gap that I just talked about. You want to show the relevance of the problem. Why do we need to know more about that? And then set the objectives of your research. This research study will. That phrase should be in the end of your lit review, which is going to move you on to your methods section. I've given you here down at the bottom, you can go back to the copy of the PowerPoint slides that are in this module. You can click on that. It's a live link that will give some information on writing a problem statement. And we'll talk about that in our next couple of classes.